Hello, I'm Peter Clote in for Esther Githui Erwat. It's Monday, April 4th. This is Africa 54.
Satellite images show a 45-foot-long trench at a grave site in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. We'll have details. With millions fleeing Ukraine since the start of Russia's invasion, the risks of human trafficking are on the rise. And advocates warn that a case against an Associated Press journalist highlights Ethiopia's decline in media freedom.
The human toll of war is acutely evident on Monday as Ukraine accuses Russian forces of carrying out a massacre in the town of Bucha, a claim that Russia denies. As Western nations react to the horrific images of civilian bodies laying in the streets of towns and cities in Ukraine, there are calls for new sanctions against Moscow. As we get more on this report from Reuters, we want to warn you that some of the images are graphic.
Ukraine's defense minister on Sunday accused Russian forces of an array of atrocities. Alexei Reznikov said the crimes came to light after Ukrainian forces moved into cities and towns after the invaders withdrew.
This is not a special operation. These are not police actions. These are ordinary racists, fascists, and inhumane who simply committed crimes against civilians. Raped, killed, shot them in the back of the head. The whole world needs to know about this.
These images, taken by Reuters witnesses in Bucha, show what appear to be victims in a mass grave and bodies lying in the streets. Bucha lies 23 miles northwest of the capital, Kyiv, an area Ukrainian troops said they recaptured on Saturday. Bucha's mayor, Anatoly Fedoruk, said on Sunday that 300 residents had been killed during a month-long occupation by the Russian army. Reuters could not immediately verify this. Russia's defense ministry denied the Ukrainian allegations, saying footage and photographs showing dead bodies in Bucha were, quote, yet another provocation by Kyiv. It said Russian military units had left Bucha on March 30th and that civilians had been free to move around the town or evacuate while it was under Russian control. But the reports and images of dead civilians brought outraged pro-Ukrainian demonstrators to the streets of Berlin on Sunday.
It's horrible. It's not about the war. It's not the war right now. They want to erase the Ukraine as the culture, as the people.
And that sentiment echoed across Western capitals. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken described images of dead bodies there as, quote, a punch in the gut. And the foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Britain, along with the European Union's foreign policy chief, expressed outrage over the reports from Bucha. Reznikov vowed to document the alleged atrocities and said Ukraine would weigh bringing charges in the International Criminal Court.
There is a whole list. These are war crimes. These are crimes against humanity.
The images of corpses in civilian clothes left behind by departing Russian troops has prompted calls from officials in Ukraine and Europe for tougher sanctions on Moscow.
The report was filed by Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden is speaking out on Bucha Monday, saying in part, quote, I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter, you saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him. He is a war criminal, end quote. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says the West should impose a new package of sanctions on Russia over the alleged killing of civilians in Bucha and other Ukrainian cities. But he says that is not enough of a punishment. He says that hundreds of people have been killed in Bucha and other cities, including civilians who had been shot.
Today, this appeal will be without congratulations. I don't want one more word. Presidents don't usually record such appeals, but that's what I have to say today. To talk about what happened in Bucha and in other cities, from where the invaders were expelled. Hundreds of people killed, civilians tortured and shot, bodies on the street, the area mined. Even the bodies of the dead were booby-trapped.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Monday said that Ukraine's version of what happened in the town of Bucha was a fake attack aimed at undermining Moscow. Lavrov says the bodies were staged and that images of them and what he says is Ukraine's false version of events had been spread on social media by Western countries and Ukraine.
На днях очередная фейковая атака была предпринята в...
The other day, another fake news attack was undertaken in the town of Bucha in the Kyiv region, after the Russian military had left according to the plans and agreements. Several days later, a fake video was staged that is now being spread through all media channels and social media by the Ukrainian representatives and their Western patrons.
Russia's top diplomat is also calling on Britain, which holds the presidency of the UN Security Council for April, to fulfill its responsibilities after it rejected a Russian request to convene a meeting over Bucha. Meanwhile, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said on Twitter, quote, "I'm deeply shocked by the images of civilians killed in Bucha, Ukraine. It is essential that an independent investigation leads to effective accountability," end quote. The European Union says it will hold discussions about a new round of sanctions on Russia following the alleged atrocities in Ukrainian towns that have been occupied by Russian forces. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is traveling to Brussels for meetings this week with other NATO foreign ministers to highlight the military alliance's resolve to hold Russia responsible for continued fighting in Ukraine. Some of the latest drone video from Ukraine shows the massive destruction to residential buildings in the besieged city of Mariupol by Russian forces. Mariupol, a port city on the Sea of Azov that is normally home to about 400,000 people, has been under heavy bombardment for weeks. Civilians trapped there have been sheltering in basements with little food, power, or running water. We have new images of the badly damaged interior of a theater in Mariupol. The pictures show the scale of Russian attacks on the Ukrainian port city. This video, shot by Reuters inside the theater on Sunday, shows the destruction caused by what local authorities say was an attack on March 16th, carried out while hundreds of people were sheltering inside the building. The mayor's office estimated on March 25th that the death toll in the theater was about 300. Russia denies bombing the building. Mariupol is one of Russia's main targets in Ukraine's southeastern region of Donbass. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told CNN, quote, "It is brutality against citizens we have not seen in decades in Europe." He says it is Russian President Vladimir Putin's responsibility to end the war. For more on the war in Ukraine, let's go to VOA's Heather Murdoch, who is standing by via Skype in Kyiv. Hello, Heather.
Hello.
What's the latest regarding the reaction of Ukrainians about the mass killings in Bucha?
We've spoken to many people here in Kyiv about this, and most people come close to or to tears when it's mentioned. Many people have told us that they still have friends or relatives in the area that they haven't found. They've heard of, as you said, about 300 people believed to be dead, but there are also many people that are unaccounted for at this moment. People are also, of course, very angry, and the government, several branches of the government, have called for international investigations into war crimes.
Well, you've been speaking with some of the residents. What have they been telling you about how the Ukrainian military has taken over some portions outside Kyiv, previously occupied by Russian forces?
You would think that Kyiv would be celebrating today, since over the weekend it was announced that the entire of the Kyiv region is controlled by Ukraine, but it's certainly not. People are not celebrating. The level of destruction in Bucha and other places have left people mourning and scared. And a lot of people do not believe that the war in Kyiv is over. People say that perhaps Russia is regrouping and planning to come back and strike harder. Other people say even if that's not the case, there's nothing to celebrate because the troops probably are just moving east and south, in their opinion, and that will mean more destruction and more death in other parts of the country.
Talking about the war not being over, I understand civilians in Ukraine are preparing for yet another continuation of the war. What have they been telling you about how they are preparing for this to occur or happen?
People all over the country have said that they are prepared to fight if necessary. And I'm talking about civilians, not just young men who are enlisted or on the reserve list for the military. We've met people of all ages who have said that they are prepared to fight. Some people are creating Molotov cocktails and other homemade weapons in their basements. Several people have told us that they have weapons at home and that if the war comes to their town, no matter how far away it is now, they're ready to fight back personally. Even the mayor of Vinnytsia told us that he carries a pistol in his bed.
Thank you very much, Heather. Viewers, Heather Murdoch reporting live via Skype from Kyiv, Ukraine. Ukraine's president is calling Russia's ongoing unprovoked war a genocide, while Western officials are condemning what they call atrocities committed by Russian forces in Kyiv suburb. VOA's Arash Arabasadi has more.
Clouds of black smoke fill the sky over Odessa. The city council says missiles struck the major Ukrainian port city known as the Pearl of the Black Sea. Odessa is also home to Ukraine's naval headquarters. A Russian Defense Ministry representative said Russian ships and aircraft fired upon oil processing facilities and fuel depots he claimed provided support to nearby Ukrainian troops. A Ukrainian official called it part of a, quote, vile practice of destroying critical infrastructure. As Russia's war on Ukraine wages into its sixth week, Ukrainian troops claim victories in pushing back Russian forces. But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warns of catastrophes for civilians living among abandoned mines, equipment, and bodies in the street, which Ukrainian soldiers in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha pull with cables fearing booby traps.
We are the citizens of Ukraine. We have more than 100 nationalities. This is about the destruction and extermination of all these nationalities. We are the citizens of Ukraine, and we don't want to be subdued to the policy of Russian Federation. This is the reason we are being destroyed.
Back in Bucha, the mayor describes civilians with hands tied behind their backs, shot in the head by retreating Russian forces. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russia has committed war crimes.
We can't become numb to this. We can't normalize this. This is the reality of what's going on every single day as long as Russia's brutality against Ukraine continues. That's why it needs to come to an end.
Despite mounting evidence to the contrary, Russia denies targeting civilians. A Ukrainian presidential advisor describes evidence of war crimes.
Among the victims of Russian crimes are raped women they tried to burn, murdered local government officials, murdered children, murdered elderly people, murdered men, many of whom had their hands tied, traces of torture, and shot in the back of their heads.
Ukrainian troops take back territory from fleeing Russian forces, shouting in Ukrainian, "Glory to the heroes." Secretary Blinken travels to a NATO meeting this week in Brussels, where he will hold talks with counterparts to highlight the alliance's resolve and further hold Russia accountable. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
The UN says 4 million people have fled Ukraine since the start of Russia's invasion. The majority are women and children, populations that are especially vulnerable to human trafficking. Lesia Bakalet has the story narrated by Anna Rice.
This is the Ukrainian-Polish border, the Shehini Medyka checkpoint. According to the latest UN data, a large proportion of Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children, fled to Poland after Russia invaded Ukraine. Many spent days waiting to cross the border.
It's very tough, of course. I don't know what else to say, but we have no choice. We need to save the children.
Since the very start of Russia's aggression, human rights activists have been warning refugees that they could be targeted by human traffickers.
The risks have definitely increased, mostly because women who cross the border with children have found themselves in an extremely vulnerable position from an economic point of view as well as psychological. They are fleeing a war. People are easier to manipulate when they are in such a state.
Human rights activist Yulia Anosova says human trafficking typically involves both sexual exploitation and violence. Polish police have already registered 2 cases of rape among refugees. Volunteers are working to inform women who might be at risk.
We've seen men taking pictures of women and teenage girls. We very quickly understood that human traffickers could be behind this.
A woman from the Kyiv region was looking for a job in Lviv. She found an employment ad, got in touch with a person of contact who offered her a job as a nanny for a 15-year-old boy. Part of the job was offering sexual services.
Refugees also risk being exploited at work. The scheme is very simple. Living quarters may be offered for free at first, and once the refugees arrive, they find out it's anything but free. Human rights activists emphasize such actions are illegal.
If there is an expectation for work, then the work should be paid. And very important. Moreover, if you have to work in the place where you live, or there is the same owner that requires you to work, I don't know, in a hotel, in a, I don't know, farm or wherever, and you are being hosted, that is a sign that you need to be aware that this is a vulnerable situation.
Half of the displaced Ukrainians are children. Some cross the border without any papers. Some cross the border alone, without parents. Such children are at risk of ending up with someone suspicious, or worse.
Missing is a result of gaps in the protection system, and gaps in the protection system are the same kinds of issues that attract traffickers.
The organization called Missing Children Europe asks refugees to immediately report any missing children using their hotline. They also encourage adults to be watchful, and if they see a child looking lost and alone in the street, to immediately alert local authorities. For women, there is also advice about how not to become a victim of human traffickers.
Ask for an ID card, for identifying them, if they have some card from the organization or something like that, to go to the tent to see if they have a tent. It's very important. If they have a tent with their name in the border, it means that it's a safe organization.
Experts also advise refugees to take pictures of important documents on their phone, stay in a group, and keep handy the phone number for the police in any country they enter. It's also important to have contact information for volunteers and aid groups, and keep in touch with relatives and close friends, so that as many people as possible know the location of each refugee. For Lisa Bakalets in Washington, Anna Rice, VOA News.
Still to come, we'll have a report on press freedoms in Ethiopia. But first, Heidi Adams tells us what's coming up on Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
Join me, Heidi Adams, on the next Straight Talk Africa. I'll have an exclusive interview with Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, said to be the world's largest free trade zone. Also, a new report reveals the link between the media's portrayals of Africa and business investments. All these stories and more on the next Straight Talk Africa.
Just into VOA, a Rwandan appeals court on Monday has upheld a 25-year jail sentence for Paul Rusesabagina, who was portrayed in the movie Hotel Rwanda, sheltering hundreds of people during the 1994 genocide. The court rejected a bid to extend it to life in prison. Rusesabagina, 67, was convicted in September on 8 terrorism charges related to the activities of an organization opposed to President Paul Kagame's rule, and is being held in a Rwandan prison. He has denied all the charges and denounced the trial as a politically motivated sham. A security deal has been reached by parties that signed South Sudan's 2018 peace agreement. President Salva Kiir's Sudan People's Liberation Movement, former rebels of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition, loyal first Vice President Riek Machar, and the South Sudan Opposition Alliance all signed an agreement sharing the command structure of the country's unified armed forces. Here to discuss this agreement is VOA's John Tanza, managing editor and co-host of the South Sudan in Focus radio program. John, welcome to Africa 54. How important is this agreement to the people of South Sudan, John?
This agreement completes the chapter in the peace agreement that was signed in 2018. There's a big chapter on security arrangement. When the parties to the agreement signed that document, there was a provision in the document that the capital cities or the major towns in South Sudan should be under the command of unified forces drawn from all the groups that have been fighting. But these forces were taken to training sites. For 3 years, they are still not graduated. And so this agreement that was signed on Sunday, the parties have agreed on the structure of the command of these unified forces, which will be drawn from all the parties to the agreement. And so they have also promised to graduate the forces within 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks' time, we will have unified forces possibly deployed in the capitals.
But John, is this agreement really different from previous agreements these leaders have signed over the years?
It's not different. It's a component of security mechanism in the 2018 peace agreement. And so, just as I was explaining, the parties could not trust each other to be in the capital. So they said, well, let us have a unified force to be in charge of security in the major towns.
Are these leaders politically committed to implementing fully this agreement? And should South Sudanese be hopeful that they will be committed to this agreement?
The sentiments we are getting from people in the country is most people are saying this is overdue. There is nothing new in what they have signed. But they are saying what is really important is in the implementation of what they have signed. Because they have signed so many documents and they have not even implemented them. Last week, the leader of the SPLM-IO, who is the first vice president of the country, Riek Machar, came with a list of the unresolved issues in the agreement, and he pulled out of the security mechanism. That actually, if you like, triggered what happened on Sunday. So it's the spirit that is there that is lacking, the spirit of commitment, the spirit of genuineness to what these people had promised to give the people of South Sudan.
Thank you very much. John Tanza is managing editor and co-host of VOA South Sudan in Focus radio program. Advocates say the case of a journalist for the Associated Press accused of abetting a government-designated terrorist group for reporting on rebels highlights Ethiopia's decline in media freedom. VOA's Salem Solomon has the story.
Amir Aman Kiaro is back home with his family after a 4-month ordeal in an Ethiopian prison. But the video journalist for the Associated Press could still face jail if convicted of violating anti-terrorism and wartime state of emergency laws. First arrested in November, Amir is accused of illegally communicating with members of a group the government designated as a terrorist organization. Under a state of emergency that was in place until February, journalists could be penalized for interviewing members of armed groups, including the Oromo Liberation Army. Amir and a freelancer, Thomas Ingeda, were detained but never charged, the AP says.
The crackdown on the media that this case represents, there is truly no true accusation that can be leveled against Amir. He is a respected, balanced journalist who has covered both sides of the conflict. He's been picked up, and this is an arbitrary detention.
With a shrinking space for reporting, several Ethiopian journalists called on the government to respect media rights. In 2021 alone, their open letter says 46 journalists were detained, making Ethiopia one of the worst jailers of journalists in Africa.
The general optimism that we had a couple of years ago with the much heralded reform, with the promises that journalists would be able to operate unperturbed, this has not panned out. The promises and the pledges did not materialize. And unfortunately, for journalists, the situation is starting to mirror what we saw in 2009, when Ethiopia passed its infamous anti-terror proclamation, which was used to round up journalists en masse. So we had to speak up about a very, very dire situation that our colleagues on the ground in Ethiopia are facing.
With little coverage of daily life in rebel-controlled regions like Oromia, the work of reporters like Amir is vital, says Zacharias.
Very few journalists have been able to gain access to areas under control of the OLA, and what life has been like for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in these areas, much of which have been subjected to internet and phone outages, we don't have an accurate picture of.
Amir's lawyer, Tadela Gabramedin, says his client has been ordered to not leave the country until the case is investigated. He's accused of working with foreign media outlets and, quote, spoiling the country's development plans, end quote, through negative reporting. VOA reached out to the Office of the Prime Minister, the Communications Ministry, and the Attorney General's office requesting comment, but received no response. Phillips says it's important to shine a light on cases like this.
We will continue to cover the story of journalists who are unjustly held. This is not acceptable behavior. These are arbitrary detentions. If there is proof of something, then that evidence has to be surfaced and has to go through a proper trial process. It's something that is extremely important to us at the AP and to our peer news organizations.
For now, Amir is free, but the risk of arrest for those in media is ever present. Salim Solomon, VOA News, Washington.
Democratic Republic of Congo's park rangers are scouring the beaches of a vanishing coastline for turtle nests so they can take the eggs to a hatching center where they are incubated for 8 weeks. Rangers say the initial success of transferring eggs is turning to despair as rising sea levels and soil erosion has consumed almost a quarter of the turtles' nesting grounds. But some turtles are getting a new lease on life. That's our show for today. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching and good evening, Africa.